Welcome classic rock fans to a short video where I get to discuss my 10 favourite artists. 10 artists I truly love, kind of an antidote to the 10 bands, artists that I hate, which I posted about 2 or 3 days ago. And stick around to the end because I'll include a few artists that kind of bother the number 11 spot. Number 10 is Joni Mitchell. Now my love for Joni Mitchell tends to be concentrated on those first 4 albums. I love that sun-dappled folk of hers. And even though the more experimental textures explored on Ladies of the Canyon, her finest album in my opinion, an opinion I share with Steve Hackett, I believe. And that's before we even get to the sublime blue. I think one critic quite waggishly said that she seemed to move her music from those folky stages to the parlour with the greater emphasis on the piano. I think for me, I love the starkness and honesty of Joni Mitchell's songwriting, unlike Dylan, who tends to be quite opaque and relies heavily on symbolism. Reading way too much T.S. Eliot in my opinion. So they're the main albums I do listen to by Joni Mitchell, those earlier first 4 albums up to Before the Roses. I know that goes against critical opinion. It tends to favour her more experimental jazzy stuff. Number 9 is Paul Simon. This guy's songwriting is absolutely incredible and he could easily stand shoulder to shoulder with Bob Dylan in my opinion. And I love his later work as well. Albums like You're the One, So Beautiful, So What, Stranger to Stranger, and of course recently 7 Psalms and that beautiful guitar motif he employs on that album. And he's an artist that experiments as well, including his collaboration with Brian Eno and the exploration of world textures, which is apparent from Simon & Garfunkel onwards, and of course reaches its fruition, I guess, with Gracelands and Rhythm of the Saints, of course. If you're interested in some great songs you want to check out by Paul Simon, go and listen to Duncan from his first solo album, I think 1971, I think that came out. That's excluding, of course, the Paul Simon song, which I think was released around about 65, which is just him showcasing the songs that he would later record with Simon & Garfunkel, not including that album. Also Old from You're the One, I love that song, and I think it's Message for the Angels from So Beautiful, So What. Beautiful, beautiful songs. Number 8 is Bruce Springsteen. A lot of you will be frothing at this one as he tends to be a divisive figure. I must admit to being absolutely blown away when Born in the USA came out. I loved that record. Everyone had a copy of that. It was like Thriller in the 1980s. But I remember, actually I feel a bit disappointed. I think we've passed the 40th anniversary of that album. There's been nothing to mark it in terms of a box set. I mean, there's loads of material he could release from that time, but anyway, that's another topic. And then of course there was that live box set that came out about this time, which was absolutely a powerful statement in terms of who Springsteen was and the E Street Band. Springsteen is one of the best live artists I've ever seen, and there's so many of his early albums that I consider to be absolutely faultless. And I realise he's not everyone's cup of tea, and his political trumpeting probably can get a bit sort of tiresome, I guess, for some. But it doesn't distract from my enjoyment of these great, great albums. I absolutely love The River as well. I realise it's a meandering affair, pretty much like a river in a way, but he wanted a big album that encompassed the whole of life. And of course, that requires 4 sides of vinyl, doesn't it? The energy and power of these albums, including the menacing and brooding strum of Nebraska. Number 7 is Billy Joel. Now, Billy Joel was one of those artists I came to love via my brother. I remember we played to death that holy trinity of albums, The Stranger, 52nd Street and Glass Houses. I just loved his band. Liberty DeVito on drums was just an absolute legend. Richie Cantano on sax, and of course Doug Stegmeyer. I also liked the fact Joel looked a bit funny looking, a bit gnarled really in many respects. It was the polar opposite to my sister's pin-ups, the Osmonds and all that stuff she had on her wall. And the songs at that time to me seemed a bit edgy as well. Tracks like Stiletto, Captain Jack, and the wonderful All for Lena. I wore the grooves of that one. Number 6 is Bob Dylan, his Bobness. My introduction to Dylan was, I think with my first wage, actually went out and bought on vinyl his Greatest Hits album. It had a white cover with him sort of holding some books, if I remember that one. I loved his sneering assessment of the human condition, and still do. And the chameleonic nature of the man, from the nasally folk singer, come you masters of war, to sepia-toned parabolist with a wonderful John Wesley Harding album. One of my favourite albums by Dylan is the, 1969 National Skyline. Not everybody's favourite, but I just love the way that album sounds, and his duo with Johnny Cash is worth the price of admission alone. It came clear to me from an early age that this guy was just extraordinary. Number 5 is the Rolling Stones. There was always something edgy and dangerous about them. I remember one of the first records I bought with my own money was that compilation. I think it was called Get Stoned. It had that big pair of lips on the front. I just adored the smacked out drawl of Keith Richards to the kind of pouty, lascivious strut of Jagger, sporting a face like a chewed toffee, as I like to say. This band, it seemed to me quite early on that this band was certainly not the Beatles. There was something repellent about them, yet appealing as well. For me, the Rolling Stones as a band have kind of lost that edge, that air of danger that they once had. I think since they became a kind of a corporate touring franchise, I think the decline probably began from the sort of 40 Licks tour onwards, quite frankly. These days I think the Stones have all the threat of a family picnic. Number 4 is Yes. Now this might upset the Yes purists, but 90125 was the album that got me into that band. The production was absolutely pristine. There's something uplifting and spiritual about this band's music that always elevates my mood. Ironic really, seeing as the band seemed to be fighting like a cats in a sack most of the time. They say this band was effectively Chris Squire and whoever else turned up. I can't help but feel that's probably true, to be honest with you. I was always blown away by Chris Squire's stage presence, and certainly miss him. Number 3 is Jethro Tull. I first saw this band performing Witch's Promise on Top of the Pops, or Top of the Pops 2 I think it was called. I was just intrigued by this gurneying, flute-playing loon, so much in fact that I dashed off into town, I think the very next day, and bought, I think it was Original Masters compilation album that came out around about 86, I think it was. Actually, to this day, I think it was on that Original Masters album, there was actually a remix of the song Aqualung. To this day, I still prefer that remix, the original on the actual album itself. But I became absolutely obsessed with that album, played the grooves off it, as I like to say. Then eventually, I think I brought the Slipstream video. I was just, again, blown away by Anderson, his stage presence and performance. And of course, it was a slippery slope, slipstream, if you like, from listening to that and buying that video to actually starting to acquire all the studio albums one by one. To this day, I still love the brilliant observational writing of Ian Anderson. And those early performances are something else. They really are, from the sense of showmanship to the Python-esque to their dalliances with prog in the early 70s. Number 2 is the Beatles. Fairly obvious choice, I know, but I remember having the Red album and the Blue album and playing those to death. I actually remember buying a copy of the White album in some second-hand record store. It was obvious to me that there was so much more to this band than Obla-Di, Obla-Da. I still love the White album for all its discordant jumbledness. In fact, its messiness, I think, is part of its charm. Although I would still maintain that the greatest Beatles album ever is Rubber Soul. Just my opinion, though. And number 1 for me is Pink Floyd. My obsession with this band began in 1979 when Another Brick in the Wall was number 1 in the charts, and seemed to be at number 1 in the charts for an absolute age while I was at school. But it was The Wall, the album The Wall, that was brought into our house in 1979, Christmas 79, I believe. I think it was a gift for my brother. I'd never heard anything like this before, which was a stark contrast to my mother's Dusty Springfield records. Of course, I became pretty obsessed with that album, and as I started to earn pennies and money on the youth training scheme way back in the 80s, I started to invest in their back catalogue via the several second-hand record shops we used to get in Reading, my hometown, by the way. I remember first listening to Dark Side of the Moon and realising then that this was something special. So The Wall is an incredibly important album for me in my musical journey, but it's an album I've rather fallen out of love with in later years, as I kind of see it. I see more of its flaws, I think, than anything that recommends it, especially in comparison to those early records. For me, Pink Floyd, I mean, their greatest from sort of 68 to about 73. I adore the Atom Heart Mother album, which would easily be my top 2 or 3 albums. I adore that record. This band embodied a sense of mystique. There were hardly any images around. There was no internet, of course, in those days. It was just this jumble of extraordinary sounds in my head. And I have to say, to this day, I still class Dark Side of the Moon as one of the finest albums ever. My favourite album of all time, in fact. So bands that bother my number 11s, but easily Genesis. I think I love that kind of churchy, hymnal feel to their music. Those early albums with Gabriel are just remarkable. Another artist that bothers my number 11 spot is easily Neil Young. Love Neil Young. His greatest track, in my opinion, is Cortez the Killer. Zuma is my favourite album. I love Harvest and After the Gold Rush. But He's an artist that doesn't seem to have any sort of quality control filter, and he's put out some real shit over the years. There you go. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do share it. Do click like, subscribe, and check the notification bell. I think I've said that. And check out the links below this video. Check out my Patreon. We're building a nice sort of classic rock community there. Be part of it, why not? You can even join for free these days. Link below. And I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.